Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Struggle for Independence, the Algerian War, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, Roots of Conflict, the historical background of Algerian independence. In the early 19th century, Algeria was a province of the Ottoman Empire. But in 1830, the French invaded and colonized the country, establishing a settler society that would last for more than a century. French Algeria was characterized by stark social and economic inequalities, with a small minority of French settlers enjoying most of the privileges and power. These inequalities led to the rise of Algerian nationalism in the early 20th century. Algerian intellectuals and political leaders sought to establish an independent Algeria that would be free from French colonial rule. But the French government was resistant to such demands, and repression of Algerian activists and political organizations was common. During World War II, the Vichy government in France aligned with Nazi Germany, and the French resistance included Algerian nationalists who fought alongside French resistance fighters. The experience of fighting for the French cause led many Algerians to believe that their loyalty to France would be recognized with the granting of independence. However, after the war, the French government refused to grant independence to Algeria. Instead, it pursued a policy of assimilation aimed at integrating Algerians into French society. This policy, however, was met with resistance by Algerian nationalists who saw it as an attempt to strip Algerians of their cultural identity. In 1954, the National Liberation Front was formed, with the aim of fighting for Algerian independence. The FLN launched a guerrilla war against French forces, with the support of many Algerians who were frustrated with their lack of political and economic power. The FLN's tactics were often brutal, with attacks on French military and civilian targets, as well as on perceived collaborators. The French responded with a campaign of repression and violence, including the use of torture against suspected FLN members. The Algerian War was a protracted conflict that lasted from 1954 to 1962. It was marked by widespread violence and brutality, as well as by international involvement. The war had a profound impact on both Algeria and France, shaping the political, social, and cultural landscapes of both countries for decades to come. Today, the Algerian War is remembered as a struggle for independence and as a moment of national liberation for Algeria. But it was also a complex and multifaceted conflict, with deep roots in Algeria's colonial past and its struggle for political and economic equality. Chapter 2, The Battle for Independence, the Early Years of the War. The Algerian War began in 1954 when the National Liberation Front launched a guerrilla war against French forces. The early years of the conflict were marked by fierce fighting and significant gains for the FLN. The FLN's tactics were focused on undermining French control and legitimacy in Algeria. They targeted French military and police installations, as well as French civilians and Algerians who were perceived as collaborating with the French. The FLN also sought to gain support from Algerians by promoting a vision of an independent Algeria that would be free from French colonial rule. One of the most significant events of the early years of the war was the Battle of Algiers. In 1957, the FLN launched a series of bombings and attacks on French targets in the city of Algiers, with the goal of forcing the French to withdraw from the city. The French responded with a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, using torture and other forms of violence against suspected FLN members and sympathizers. The Battle of Algiers highlighted the brutality of the conflict and drew international attention to the situation in Algeria. It also demonstrated the strength and resilience of the FLN, which was able to withstand the French military's onslaught and continue the fight for independence. During this period, the FLN was also able to build significant support among the Algerian population. The organization established a parallel system of governance in areas under its control, providing social services and promoting the use of Arabic instead of French in education and government. These efforts helped to solidify the FLN's position as the leading force in the struggle for Algerian independence. However, the FLN also faced significant challenges during the early years of the war. The French military was well equipped and well trained, and was able to inflict significant losses on the FLN. The FLN also struggled with internal divisions and disagreements over strategy, with some factions advocating for a more radical approach and others advocating for negotiations with the French. Despite these challenges, the FLN was ultimately able to establish a foothold in Algeria and to challenge French control over the country. The early years of the war were marked by intense fighting and significant gains for the FLN, setting the stage for the later years of the conflict and the eventual independence of Algeria. Chapter 3: International Involvement, the Global Context of the Algerian War. The Algerian War was not just a conflict between Algeria and France, but also involved a range of international actors. This chapter will explore the role that these actors played in the conflict and how global events shaped the course of the war. One of the key factors in the international context of the Algerian War was the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a global struggle for influence, and the Algerian War was one of many conflicts in which this struggle played out. Initially, the United States supported French efforts to maintain control over Algeria, believing that a French victory would help to contain Soviet influence in the region. But as the war dragged on and reports of French atrocities and human rights abuses mounted, the U.S. shifted its position, calling for negotiations and an end to the conflict. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, supported the Algerian nationalists and provided military and diplomatic assistance to the FLN. The Soviet Union saw the Algerian War as an opportunity to gain influence in the region and weaken French power. Other countries also played a role in the conflict. The United Nations, for example, passed several resolutions calling for an end to the violence and negotiations between France and the FLN. The UN also established a commission to investigate allegations of human rights abuses in Algeria. The Arab League, a regional organization composed of Arab states, also supported the Algerian cause. Many Arab countries provided financial and military assistance to the FLN, and Algerian nationalists sought to present their struggle as part of a larger Arab and Islamic movement for independence and self-determination. The international context of the Algerian War also included non-state actors, such as journalists, activists, and intellectuals who brought attention to the conflict and advocated for Algerian independence. Many of these individuals were based in France, where they faced repression and censorship from the French government. Ultimately, the international context of the Algerian War had a significant impact on the course of the conflict. The support of the Soviet Union and other countries provided the FLN with critical resources and diplomatic cover, while pressure from the United States and other Western countries contributed to France's decision to negotiate an end to the war. The legacy of international involvement in the Algerian War can still be seen today, both in the ongoing impact of the conflict on Algeria and in the global struggles for independence and self-determination that continue to shape our world. Chapter 4: Violence and Repression, the Brutalities of the Algerian War. The Algerian War was a violent and brutal conflict that took a toll on both Algerians and French forces. This chapter will explore the human toll of the war, including the use of torture, the targeting of civilians, and the psychological impact of the conflict. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Algerian War was the use of torture by French forces against suspected FLN members and sympathizers. The use of torture was widespread and systematic, and included techniques such as electric shocks, waterboarding, and sexual assault. The goal of the torture was to extract information and to intimidate Algerians who were suspected of supporting the FLN. The use of torture was not limited to the military and police forces, but also involved civilian authorities such as the French intelligence agency, the STIS. The extent of the torture was kept secret from the French public, but was later revealed by journalists and historians, leading to a public reckoning and apologies from French officials. The FLN also engaged in brutal tactics, including attacks on French civilians and Algerians who were perceived as collaborating with the French. The FLN also targeted moderate Algerians who opposed the FLN's tactics, including intellectuals and religious leaders. These attacks contributed to a climate of fear and insecurity in Algeria and led to the displacement of many Algerians. The psychological impact of the war was also significant, with both combatants and civilians experiencing trauma and stress. French soldiers were exposed to violence and brutality, and many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after returning home. Algerians who were caught in the crossfire of the conflict also experienced psychological trauma, including depression and anxiety. The violence and repression of the Algerian War had a profound impact on both Algeria and France. In Algeria, the war led to the displacement of millions of people and the deaths of tens of thousands. In France, the war contributed to a sense of disillusionment with the government and the military, and sparked protests and social unrest. Today, the legacy of the Algerian War continues to be felt in both countries. The war is remembered as a moment of national liberation for Algeria, but it is also recognized as a period of violence and trauma. The use of torture and other forms of violence in the conflict has also had a lasting impact on international human rights norms and the treatment of prisoners of war. Chapter 5: Negotiating Independence, the End of the Algerian War. The Algerian War lasted for 8 years, from 1954 to 1962. The final years of the conflict were marked by intense fighting and significant gains for the FLN, but also by a growing recognition among French leaders that a negotiated settlement was necessary. In 1958, General Charles de Gaulle was appointed as the President of France, and he soon recognized the need to resolve the conflict in Algeria. De Gaulle saw Algeria as a burden on France's economy and a threat to its stability, and believed that negotiations with the FLN were necessary to bring an end to the conflict. The negotiations that followed were complex and difficult, with both sides initially taking a hardline approach. The FLN demanded full independence for Algeria, while the French government sought to maintain some control over the country and its resources. In 1960, the French government proposed a plan that would have granted Algeria limited autonomy within France, but this proposal was rejected by the FLN. The FLN continued to fight for independence, with the support of many Algerians who were frustrated with their lack of political and economic power. In 1961, the FLN launched a series of attacks on French targets in Algeria and France, including a bombing campaign in Paris. The French government responded with a campaign of repression, including the use of torture and other forms of violence against suspected FLN members. Despite these challenges, negotiations between the French government and the FLN continued. In March 1962, the Evian Accords were signed, granting Algeria independence and establishing a framework for the transfer of power from France to Algeria. The Evian Accords were followed by a referendum in Algeria, in which the majority of Algerians voted in favor of independence. On July 3, 1962, Algeria officially declared independence, ending more than a century of French colonial rule. The end of the Algerian War had a profound impact on both Algeria and France. In Algeria, the country experienced significant political and social changes, including the establishment of a new government and the implementation of land reform programs. However, the country also faced significant economic challenges, including a lack of infrastructure and limited resources. In France, the end of the war led to a period of political instability and social unrest. Many French citizens felt disillusioned with their government and the military, and protests and strikes were common. The war also contributed to a broader sense of questioning of French identity and values. Today, the legacy of the Algerian War continues to be felt in both Algeria and France. The conflict is remembered as a moment of national liberation for Algeria, but also as a period of violence and trauma. The war also had a lasting impact on French politics and society, and helped to shape the post-colonial landscape of both countries. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.